Hello and welcome to the University of Alberta's Opening Up Copyright instructional module on the history of copyright. Copyright is increasingly important in our modern economy, but for much of copyright's 300-plus year history, it has been relatively unimportant for the overwhelming majority of people. So how did things end up this way? Copyright effectively began in 1710 with the Statute of Anne in Great Britain. While the Statute of Anne was passed to deal with concerns of publishers over book reprinting, the preamble of the Act is notable. The statute was intended as an act for the encouragement of learning by vesting the copies of printed books in the authors or purchasers of such copies during the times therein mentioned. Wait a minute, that can't be right. Copyright is to encourage learning? Isn't it supposed to be about an incentive to create and promote economic prosperity? So how did copyright go from an act for the encouragement of learning to a modern economic policy? For starters, copyright has expanded from covering just printed books to covering all forms of creative expression. It has also expanded in relation to the term or length of copyright protection. We can't pack the entirety of copyright's expansionary history into this module, so we will focus on 10 key events to help explain its changing purpose and role in society, both for Canada and for the rest of the world. The first key event is the Statute of Anne. As noted earlier, the scope of copyright was initially narrow. It only covered printed books. The term of protection in the statute is also of note. Books published before the statute gained copyright protection for 21 years after they were written, while new books would be protected for 14 years, with the option of an additional 14 years of protection if the author was still alive at the end of the first term. The second key event is the U.S. Constitution. The 1787 U.S. Constitution included a clause empowering Congress to protect authors and inventors. Just 3 years later, in 1790, the newly independent United States would pass its first Copyright Act. Like the Statute of Anne, the term of protection was 14 years, with the right of renewal for a second 14-year period if the author was still alive. Additionally, this too was explicitly an act to promote the encouragement of learning. The third key event is the Berne Convention. Throughout the 19th century, copyright protection became more common, and concerns about international copyright protection became an issue. This culminated in the 1886 crafting of the Berne Convention. The Berne Convention has been revised several times, with numerous parties joining along the way. One notable change was the 1908 revision that stipulated member countries could provide copyright protection for a minimum term of life of the author plus 50 years. This move to a life plus 50-year term of protection was driven by the desire from various governments to harmonize the term of protection. The fourth key event, a Copyright Act for Canada. Canada passed its first domestic Copyright Act in 1921, modeled directly off the 1911 UK Act. A few years later, in 1928, Canada joined the Berne Convention as a party in its own right, though had previously been part of the convention through its dominion relationship with the UK. The fifth key event is TRIPS. The 1980s saw intellectual property protection and free trade become linked, reflecting in part the growth of information and service-based industries. This led to the 1994 Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. This World Trade Organization agreement introduced a considerably stronger level of international protection to copyright holders than had previously been the case under Berne. The sixth key event is the U.S. Copyright Term Extension Act. In 1998, U.S. musician turned congressman Sonny Bono led the crafting of the Copyright Term Extension Act that expanded the term of protection in the U.S. from life plus 50 to life plus 70 years. The act is sometimes called the Mickey Mouse Copyright Term Extension Act because it ensured that Steamboat Willie, an animated short film from 1928 that first depicted Disney's iconic rodent, would not enter the public domain for an additional 20 years. The seventh key event is Taberge. As copyright rose in importance over the decades, it was also taking on more visibility in Canadian courts. 2002 marked the first major Canadian Supreme Court case on copyright, the Taberge decision. The High Court's 2002 ruling explicated that the purpose of copyright was to balance the rewarding of creators with encouraging the dissemination of works, and it even cautioned against protecting creators' rights excessively. The eighth key event is the 2004 CCH case. Although fair dealing had been a part of Canada's Copyright Act since the 1920s, it was only during the CCH case that the Supreme Court of Canada outlined how to apply fair dealing. CCH laid the groundwork for making determinations about whether a specific dealing with a copyright-protected work is fair, and thus not an infringement of copyright. The ninth key element, the pentalogy. 2012 marked another milestone in Supreme Court jurisprudence, with the court releasing 5 decisions on copyright in the summer of that year. The 5 cases, known as the pentalogy, dealt with a variety of issues, but the SOCAN and Alberta education cases were particularly notable for their application of the CCH 6-factor test for determining if a dealing is fair. The 10th key element is the Copyright Act review. In 2017, Canada began a lengthy, statutorily mandated review of the Copyright Act, with issues such as educational fair dealing being hotly contested by various parties. Both the industry and heritage committees of the House of Commons delivered contrasting reports on how the Copyright Act might be revised. Regardless of what new issues emerge, such as copyright for AI-generated content, the history of copyright shows how it has transformed from a very limited set of protections designed to encourage learning to a large and complicated set of creator and user rights with an increasingly economic nature. You should now be able to recall key events relevant to the history of copyright in Canada, understand how copyright has evolved, in particular from a means of encouraging learning to an economic policy, and understand how copyright's history is shaped by the interplay of domestic and international factors. This has been the University of Alberta's Opening Up Copyright instructional module on the history of copyright. Thank you for your attention.